afternoon. My name is Donovan Hoggard, and today I will be giving my TED Talk on the topic of people. And I know you may be wondering, what am I going to talk about? I mean, there's so many things that people have done, that people have accomplished, but one of the things that I want to focus in on is over history, how have people communicated? And this takes us all the way back to the very beginnings of history, regardless of when you think that is. People have communicated through sound. You think about language, and language is just sounds that we attribute meaning to. We say the word crash, and we know that a crash is something that happens when two things collide. We do that all the time, and we think it's simple, but these sounds are how we communicate. More than just sounds, we have writing conventions. I mean, what is a letter if nothing more than just a scribble that we assign meaning to? We recognize A as A, but you take it over to a Chinese village who has never heard of English, never seen English, and it doesn't mean anything to them. Likewise, you take some Mandarin Chinese characters and give it to us, and it doesn't mean anything. So we have writing conventions that give meaning to different things we attribute them to. And those two together, sound and writing conventions, give us what we know today as formal language. And formal language, we can do so many things with. And one thing in particular is we can talk. We can explain ideas. We can give up ideas. We can give plays. We can do all these different things because of formal language. Back in ancient Greece, there was one famous work that kind of came out of ancient Greece that many of us have at least heard of, the Odyssey. Now, if I say the Odyssey, most of you are thinking Homer's Odyssey, which is valid, because that's who we attribute today to the Odyssey. But a lot of people don't really think Homer just sat down and wrote it like we think of someone just sitting down and writing a book. Like if I were to give you a book written by someone, you would just assume that person sat down and wrote the book. But that's not really what Homer did. At least that's not what we think through looking at history. Homer most likely came up with some of these ideas. There was a lot of Greek gods and goddesses, which is what the Odyssey is about. It's about the adventures of these god and goddesses. And these would be given orally through plays. So you would go to a play and someone would kind of take bits and pieces of all these different stories and put them together, and they would make a play up on the spot. They didn't have a script. It's not like if you did high school, it's not like you did like a Shakespearean play in high school. It was completely improv. But they were actually really talented because they had all these different elements that they had to mesh together. And so when we look at the Odyssey, we see that it was most likely all these people, centuries after centuries, of taking bits and pieces from each other that finally got written down and is called what we know today as the Odyssey. Along with the Odyssey, we just have like ancient rhetoric. We're going to talk about rhetoricians in the next slide, but just ancient rhetoric, the art of arguing, of persuasion. This is something that was very important early in history, because people learned how important ideas actually were and learned how important it was to debate these ideas, to talk about them. And people did that. They didn't just like meet in a private room and talk about these things. Like they went out into the public and did this. A lot of this shows up in what we know today as the Roman Empire, or just Rome in general. The Forum was a big place. Think of like think of a Times Square-esque place where you have a market where you're buying and selling food, buying and selling goods. You have courts where law is happening. You have theaters where performances are happening. basically anything you can think of was happening at the forum. And one thing that was happening was public speeches. We have Octavian, Cicero, and Aristotle. These guys are the rhetoricians that I was talking about earlier, and they gave speeches. They would go to these public forums, they would get people's insight, they would argue with people so that they could not only influence people, they could bolster what they actually believe, which was very important for these guys and very important just for how we think of things. If these guys didn't put in the blood, sweat, and tears of doing that, then we would never have a lot of the thought processes we have today. We also just have performances, like I mentioned earlier. You had like the oral tradition of giving plays like the Odyssey. It didn't stop. It continued to go on, and this would also happen at the Forum. Jumping all the way to American history, because that's something we are probably more accustomed to. But American history, we have speeches, and I don't have to explain that to you because a lot of you in elementary school, middle school, high school have probably memorized in part, but maybe even the whole of the Gettysburg Address. When I say 70 years ago, you know what I'm talking about. You know it's the Gettysburg Address, because that's something that is so integral as part of our education system and just us as Americans. We also have the I Have a Dream speech. When I mention MLK, most people think of I Have a Dream. And then we have FDR's Pearl Harbor Address, the date that will live in infamy. We have so many other speeches that if I mention part of it, you'll know exactly what it is, because speeches are just subconsciously ingrained. And it didn't stop with old American history. We have current day, TED Talks, what I'm doing right now. These TED Talks, like we watch them all the time, we think they're so intriguing, and we learn so much from them. And we also have podcasts. I don't know about you guys, but like Joe Rogan, I know Ben Shapiro has a podcast. There's so many of these that sometimes we listen to them, but a lot of times we watch them. We watch these performances, these talks, and then just in the academic world. That's what teaching is just monologues. A teacher is there to inform you about a subject, and if nothing else, they're essentially giving a TED Talk on whatever subject they're teaching. So you may be asking just why? Like, why am I talking about this? And why am I telling you about all these different ways of speaking? Well, this brings me to the main point of this is I encourage each and every one of you to give a public speech sometime in your professional career. And I know that may seem daunting, and I know immediately some red flags are going up as mine were, as I'm not a good speaker. Like, I can't do that. I don't like talking in front of people, and I understand. But I'd like for you to just listen to me, hear me out a little bit. And as I go through, perhaps I will convince you a little bit, or at least make you see the benefit, whether you will follow through or not. The first thing that I think is important is just that a speech can be so moving for the audience. I know a lot of us can probably name something that we have sat down and listened to, whether it was a sermon from a pastor, or perhaps it was one of the speeches I mentioned earlier, one of the books that I mentioned, that just really stuck with us, that we took away something that was really profound. First, you can inform them on a topic. I know a lot of times it's just understanding that an issue is actually happening. I know Sound of Freedom recently came out, and that was it was emotionally grabbing, but it was also just the information of it, that this stuff actually goes on, was so impactful. Also, just encouraging the audience. We want to encourage them to action. And that kind of brings me to why it's profitable for you as well, is because as you prepare for a speech, you become more informed about it. I heard someone once say, you don't know anything until you can explain it to a fifth grader. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. It's very hard to actually know a subject until you sit down and start thinking through it and start writing on it. And then you can encourage yourself to also go out and act on whatever you're preaching. That you're not just saying it, but that you're actually buckling down and following through. If you give a challenge to someone else that you wouldn't do, I think there's a problem in that. So I'm always a fan of practicing what you preach. How, you may ask? I know a lot of people say, like, oh, you should do this, you should do that, and they never really explain why. So I'd like to give you 6 just brief tips on what I think makes up a good speech and what I think a good speech entails and how you should approach it. First, I want to talk about extemporaneous speaking. So, extemporaneous speaking is speaking somewhat unprompted. So, in extemporaneous speaking, usually you have some sort of prompt, but it's not like you wrote everything out. And extemporaneous speaking is very hard because it takes a lot of skill, it takes a lot of familiarity with your material. But if you're gonna do it well, if you're gonna do a TED talk or a formal speech, I think this is the best way to go about it. Really making sure that you know the material so well that you can regurgitate it off the top of your memory. And the way you do that is with these 6 steps. The first is strategic outlining. So you want to make sure, like I said, informing yourself about the subject is through this outlining process. As you outline, you need to make sure that you really know what you're talking about. And so being strategic about it, making sure that you aren't including things that are unnecessary or not including things that are necessary, just being really mindful of how you're going about this outlining process. Second thing is as you outline, I want you to pick out a single sentence. We call this the aha moment. This happens a lot in Christian circles, especially on Sundays. We listen to a pastor preach. There's usually that one-liner is what we usually call it, but like that one sentence that he wants to drive home. And he usually, he'll say, if nothing else, then take this away, and that's like his one-liner. So as you're going throughout your speech, think of like 1 or 2 things that you're gonna make stick out that you want someone to take home, and make those single sentences just like super impactful, like super concise, super informative, that when someone goes away from your speech, they're not going to remember your whole 15-20 minute speech, but they're going to remember those 1 or 2 sentences that you have. Very impactful. And then after you get those 2 steps down, you're going to go into style and sound. So you're not just going to have your outline and just read off of it. You're going to make it into your style. If you're speaking to a bunch of middle schoolers versus you're speaking at a board meeting at your work, they're going to be totally different. So just making sure that you know what style, what sound, what different literary devices you want to use, depending on the setting, whether it's professional, academic, or whatever else. Just make sure that your style and sound are on point and that you're not being inappropriate with the way that you tackle this speech. Speak to the sensations. This one's very important. If you're trying to convince someone to do something, make sure that you're doing it in the correct way. I read a book, and one of the examples that they gave was about an English Bible translation. And a lot of people, when they choose translations, is basically just based off of what they're used to, what they like. And so using a logical or academic argument may not be as helpful. Likewise, if you're trying to convince someone to maybe adopt children, maybe a more emotional approach would be better because you're speaking to their heart, and that's what's going to drive that decision. More than just a pure logical, if you just brought statistics, it may not work as well. So just making sure that you understand the situation and how you're going to persuade. This is mainly with persuasive speeches. just how you're going to persuade them. Make sure that you're speaking to the right sensations. Sympathize with the audience, or sympathize with the hurting, which is usually your audience. Especially if you go on to speak about an issue, a really hotly debated issue, or speaking for a certain group of people, you have to be sympathetic. And all this comes out of the last part, is serving your audience well. All of this is about servant speaking and making sure that you're serving your audience. Like, that is what you're there for, is to serve them well, to encourage them, to inform them, like we talked about earlier. If you're not serving your audience well, then you really aren't doing a good job. I would just like to wrap up and just encourage you guys that you can always, there's always something to talk about. Everyone's passionate about something. And I encourage you, at least one point in your academic career, to just give a speech. You might be terrified to do it. I think most people would be terrified to do it. I encourage you to step out of that bubble and do it anyways. Thank you.